The year was 1876. Never before had the turn of a century been so poised for a revolution in thought. Science was being crowned as the new king of knowledge. Centuries-old beliefs were collapsing with bewildering rapidity. Yet, the 1870s, 80s, and 90s also saw a bold resurgence of belief in spirits and afterlife, and the possibility of communicating with the dead. The dramatic conflict between science and spiritualism was played out in a bizarre London courtroom trial in 1876, when a famous American psychic, Dr. Henry Slade, was charged with bilking the gullible public at fraudulent seances. At Slade's trial, which was usually missing from the history books, the two greatest naturalists of the 19th century, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, took opposing sides when the supernatural went on trial. It was an exciting time. All the sciences were piling up discoveries, but the overarching presence was that of Charles Darwin and evolution. He was almost deified. Now here's a picture, rarely seen over here, of a 1920s Darwin statue in the Moscow Darwin Museum. It's an image of a great thinker, a hero of socialist realism, but practically a secular god. Many statues of him have been created all over the world. He was honored with images of a Socrates-like Darwin, a brooding Darwin, even a giant sand sculpture of Darwin in front of London's Natural History Museum. But his junior partner, the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, never got a statue. In fact, he could barely find enough teaching or lecture work to support his family. The brilliant naturalist, social thinker, social critic, author, polymath, and biogeographer was honored during his final decades. He died in 1913. He had received awards, he received dinners, but he never got a statue. Darwin's German disciple, Ernest Haeckel, a gifted artist, lectured on evolution in theaters he decorated with a Gothic display of skeletons and embryos and stuffed apes. At the time of Darwin's death in 1882, a contemporary cartoon shows Haeckel offering a halo to his hero upon his death as Darwin ascends into the clouds accompanied by his beloved apes. Some of the statues of Darwin's opponents did not fare well, especially the anti-evolutionist professor Louis Agassiz of Harvard, who taught a kind of creationism to his zoology students. During the 1906 earthquake in California at Stanford University, his statue fell headfirst off the zoology building, and the president of the college remarked, I really much preferred Agassiz in the abstract than in the concrete. Respect for some of Darwin's heroic images has lately eroded a bit. Now, there's a statue of Darwin in England that has had a traffic cone put on his head by a bunch of rowdy students. I don't know whether they were thinking he was a dunce or a wizard with that cone on. I'm not sure which. Of course, in the New York subways, you see the iconic Darwin when we had the show about him here at the museum. And someone put him up on the subway next to Curious George, the monkey. Well, there's our man. I happened to find this picture in an obscure archive. It had not been seen in 100 years. And I saw it and I published it in Scientific American in 1996. And now this picture is everywhere. It's now the iconic Darwin picture. It was the last photo taken of him, and he used it as a visiting card, but for some reason it disappeared for 100 years. Well, let's quickly Darwin was interested in beetles when he was a young man, and he was the original Beatlemania guy to go to. Sailed on the Beagle, well, all over the world. Wonderful painting by Collier. And when he went in the forest, the mind is a chaos of delight, he said. Darwin and Wallace shared a kind of rapture, and our lecturer tonight has it. It's just this being swept into an admiration for the natural world. And there's Captain Fitzroy, and that's some lines from one of my songs.
Savage squaws in gowns and bonnets, spear-toting natives quoting sonnets.
That's what Fitzroy wanted to do. He wanted to civilize these people and make them into little Englishmen, so that when a sailor was shipwrecked off the coast of South America, which they often did, they would be rescued by the Indians, who would address them in English and serve them some tea and shepherd's pie. Of course, it didn't work out that way. One of the Indians, known as Jemmy Button, threw off his clothes when he got back home, threw off all his civilization, and took a wife. Darwin went back to his island, too, his own home in the English countryside, and settled down to married life. His new wife was his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, heiress to the Wedgwood China fortune. Now, the Wedgwoods were known for two things: their piety and their crockery. And in the case of her brother, Hensley, who believed he could speak with departed spirits, their crack pottery as well. So Darwin spent 8 years in his house studying barnacles. After 8 years, said Darwin, no man ever hated a barnacle as much as I did, not even a sailor on a slow-moving ship. And this is the study in which he wrote his books. And you can go there. You know, it's a museum now. Anybody can just go there. It's wonderful. It's been preserved. So then he gets a letter from Wallace, a young man, 14 years his junior, working alone in the forests of Malaysia, had a malarial fit in his hammock and came up with exactly the same idea of evolution by natural selection, which you probably heard about several times this morning, and he sent it to Darwin. And he, in turn, got involved with his friends, Joseph Hooker, the botanist, and Charles Lyell, the geologist. They were never all in the same room when it came. This is a Russian artist's conception. But Darwin received this alone. I never saw a more striking coincidence in all my life, he said. So there's old Wallace. This is a wonderful picture of Wallace as an old man. It was given to me by the great-grandson of Darwin, Quentin Keynes, and it was inscribed from the grandson of Wallace to the great-grandson of Darwin. Now this picture's everywhere too, I guess. I said, surely you mean his great-grandson. And I met the man. I think it's Richard Wallace, a retired mathematics professor. And I said to him, I had one opportunity at this meeting in Germany to talk to him for 2 minutes, and I said, listen, may I have the audacity to ask you a question that I've always wanted to ask a descendant of Wallace? He said, sure, what is it? I said, does the Wallace family hold any bad feelings, any animosity towards the Darwin family for their patriarch having been overshadowed by Charles Darwin so completely? And the man looked at me with these clear blue eyes and this gray beard. It looked like Wallace himself standing there, because Wallace had a very penetrating, honest, open face. And the man said to me, grandfather didn't mind. Why should we? Well, you know the story of their butterfly collecting and so on, and the Malay Archipelago, that famous, wonderful book that has been continuously in print since it appeared in the 1850s, readable still today. I must say that although Darwin is one of my great heroes, I think Wallace was a better writer. Now, There's spiritualism, okay? There's an illustration from a contemporary book on spiritualism done with a double exposure, which was the CGI special effects of its day, a ghostly apparition appearing. And to give you an idea of how close science and spiritualism were at that time, so intertwined, not separated as they are today, this is an article from the New York Times, Sunday Times, from 1913. Quoting a professor at Columbia, "Life after death declared proved by evolution." And there's a series of skulls, including the discredited Piltdown, by the way, as part of the series. Prominent scientist holds that man's ascent from apes means an incessant evolutionary process for humanity, not stopped by the grave, and proves the existence of a supreme being. So there you have an anthropology professor looking at a collection of skulls and deciding that it proves the existence of a supreme being. You know, you see what you want to see. Now, Thomas Huxley, of course. Why didn't I think of that? Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. Huxley showed the anatomy of man's place in nature. He showed that humans and apes were much more similar to each other than either were to monkeys. Now, Huxley hated spiritualists as frauds, as shams. This was a contemporary cartoon of a spirit-rapping seance, and it's called "What Foxes Will Say, Geese and Asses Will Believe." And that was a popular saying at the time, and here it is illustrated. In fact, the poet Browning wrote a famous poem called "Sludge the Medium," in which he took to task, it was based on the character that I started to tell you about in the beginning, Henry Slade, who had the trial in England, the first time that a scientist ever sued a psychic for conducting fraudulent scientific experiments, and had him dragged up to Bow Street Court as a fraud and an imposter. Nowadays, we don't criminalize psychics anymore. We give them their own television shows and let them become very wealthy. Of course, the whole monkey thing is raging at the time. Are we from apes? Are we from monkeys? And of course, I can't resist throwing in the scene that took place at Oxford in 1860, the debate between Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce. Huxley was a young rebel at the time, trying to insert evolution into everything, and finally the bishop said, perhaps Professor Huxley would care to tell us, is he descended from an ape on the side of his grandfather or his grandmother? Oh, what an insult to Victorian womanhood. Huxley jumped up and he said, and by the way, there are several versions of this. No one knows exactly what happened. There's 10 different reports of it. But apparently Huxley said something like this: "Ladies and gentlemen, my Lord Bishop, when we speak of descent in biology, we speak in terms of thousands, perhaps millions of years. It would never have occurred to me to bring such a question up as this of my own immediate ancestry in a gathering of this kind. But if the question is put to me, would I rather have for an ancestor a venerable grinning ape or a man of great oratorical power, a man of great intellect, a man of great position, a man of great power and influence, who uses that power and that privilege and that influence for the mere purpose of introducing mockery into a serious scientific discussion, why then I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape." A lady fainted. And Darwin said, "How durst thou talk to a living bishop in such a fashion?" Funny thing was that later on, they became so famous for this that Huxley and Wilberforce repeated the debate around different venues, you know. It was like, what was it Gordon Liddy used to do with Timothy Leary? They would just, you know, they would just have a dog and pony show on the road. But one day, the bishop died, and how he died was he was riding a horse on a friend's estate over a rocky field. The horse threw him. The bishop fell down and split his head open on a rock, and Huxley wrote,
Dear Darwin, I see our friend the bishop has met an end all too fitting for his life. His brains have finally made contact with hard reality, and the result was fatal. Let me tell you the story of the Slade trial. What happened? An American psychic came to London, a spirit medium. His name was Henry Slade. He gave seances for a guinea a seance. He caused quite a stir. Everybody was trying to get Darwin to go to one of the seances. He refused. He said, I'm a terrible bigot on the subject. I don't believe in it. So he sent Huxley. He issued an order, a ukase to Huxley, go there under a pseudonym and find out what you can. And Huxley went under his middle name, Mr. Henry, and he came back and said that it was all just nonsense, trickery, you could see right through it. Darwin said, well, just as I thought. Meanwhile, a student of Huxley's named Ray Lancaster, wanting to impress Darwin and Huxley, attended a seance. Now, what the guy did was he would hold a slate under a table in the dark, and it would come up with written things on it in chalk, answers to your questions from his dead wife. You asked a question, his dead wife would answer it on the slate. Lancaster snatched the slate away and said, I haven't asked the question yet, and the slate is full of writing. You are a fraud and an imposter. And he took Slade to court and prosecuted him for fraud. Now, the key to the whole story is this. It took me a long time to find it, but I found it. Darwin secretly sent 10 pounds, which was a lot of money in those days, to Lancaster and said, I would like to contribute to the cost of the prosecution as I consider this a public benefit. Who was the star witness for the defense? Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Wallace thought that this man Slade was just about as honest and as full of integrity as anybody in the field of natural science. That's what he said at the trial. And magicians got up, Maskelyne the magician got up and did the slate tricks and did other tricks, ghost tricks, and the audience was wowed. And the judge said, enough of this. This doesn't prove anything. It just proves that you can make something look like this, but it doesn't prove that they did it this way. I read all the transcripts in the London Times. It was the big deal of the day. Slade was convicted under an old law against fortune tellers, but never served a day in jail. A sharp lawyer got the verdict set aside on a legal loophole, and Slade fled to Europe, where he enjoyed great success first in France and Russia. But he kept getting caught and exposed so many times that eventually he died, disgraced and in poverty, in a cheap rooming house in New York. I published the story of the Slade trial in 1996 in Scientific American. And by the way, I have in my article a picture of the slates with the chalk writing still on it. I had it photographed in the Cambridge Library. They had it in an uncatalogued collection, and they said, Richard, we don't know what this is. Do you? I said, boy, do I ever. This is the slate of Henry Slade. And it had a letter inserted into it by Hensley Wedgwood, Darwin's brother-in-law, saying, I've watched this, and there was no trickery. Hensley wanted to be a great scientist. Hensley thought that Darwin and Galton and all the Darwin family were so brilliant
And he wanted to be part of that. And he kept telling Darwin, there's a whole world out there, a new world to discover. And Darwin said, yeah, fine. And that was that. There's an interesting postscript about Hensley Wedgwood. In 1880, he sent Darwin a long handwritten manuscript, a spiritualist's synthesis of science and religion. Would Darwin read it and perhaps suggest where it might be published? In a melancholy mood, Darwin sat down to reply to his cousin. He may have remembered the times Wedgwood had gone to bat with him many years before, many times. He had helped persuade Darwin's father to let him go on the voyage of the HMS Beagle expedition, and it was to his cousin that Darwin had once entrusted publication of his theory of natural selection if he were to die. My dear cousin, Darwin wrote, it is indeed a long time since we met, and I suppose if we now did so, we should not know one another, but your former image is perfectly clear to me. However, he refused even to read Hensley's paper, writing, there have been too many such attempts to reconcile Genesis and science. The two cousins who had once been so close were now hopelessly estranged over the question of science and the supernatural. That same year, Lancaster, now a professor of zoology, declined requests to continue ghost busting. The spirit medium, he wrote in an 1880 letter to the Pall Mall Gazette, is a curious and unsavory specimen of natural history, and if you wish to study him, you must take him unawares. I have done my share of the skunk hunting. Let others follow. He was later appointed director of the British Museum of Natural History. Ironically, in 1912, Lancaster, the nemesis of fakers, was completely fooled by the Piltdown Man hoax, one of the most notorious frauds in the history of evolutionary biology. For the next 40 years, scientists accepted the ape man fragments dug up about 25 miles from Darwin's home. How likely is that the first ancestor of man would be found 25 miles from Darwin's home? Come on. Remains of the missing link. Fired with enthusiasm for the Darwin-Wallace theory, Lancaster and the younger generation of evolutionists uncritically embraced this fossil forgery. Huxley, who died in 1895, knew full well that more than a few scientists were prone to develop their own irrationally held beliefs. While young, he had battled churchmen to establish the scientific approach to unraveling human origins. No ghosts or goblins or spirits, please, said Huxley, in our theories. In The Descent of Man, this is a wonderful quote, Darwin himself had urged a skeptical approach to unconfirmed observations. He believed that accepting flimsy evidence is much more dangerous than adopting incorrect theories. Quote from Darwin, false facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often long endure. But false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm, as everyone takes a salutary pleasure in proving their falseness. Better to have a false theory than a false piece of evidence. That will throw you off the rails. Now, the whole thing, spiritualism, was invented by a couple of girls called the Fox sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox, in Hydesville, New York. They conversed with spirits that were rapping. You'd go in their house and you would hear all kinds of knocks and raps, and they'd say, oh, the spirits are here. Now, Darwin would never think of such a thing, of trying to mimic the tricks of the trade, but Huxley loved to beat them at their own game. He mastered the art of loudly snapping his toes inside his boots. And he would say, I think the spirits are coming. And now, listen to the kind of detail the great scientist gives you. Quote Huxley, by dint of patience, perseverance, and practice, the toe snaps may be repeated very rapidly and rendered forte or piano at pleasure. To produce the best effect, says Huxley, it is advisable to have thin socks and a roomy, hard-soled boot. Moreover, it is well to pick out a thin place in the carpet so as to profit by the resonance of the floor. The solution to the mysterious ghost wrappings and glowing images of dead relatives hovering in darkened rooms is now no longer baffling to us. Over the years, professional illusionists have taken delight in showing us how the ghostly phenomena was staged. But a much larger mystery in our story remains unresolved. The enigmatic mind of Alfred Russel Wallace. Even in his own day, he drove his friends and admirers mad, trying to understand how he could reconcile his scientific brilliance with his mysticism. It sometimes seemed even to his contemporaries that there were two Wallaces, the Wallace of natural selection and biogeography and the discovery of Wallace's line, and the Wallace who thought that the human mind could not possibly have been produced by natural selection acting alone, but required a boost from what he called the unseen universe of spirit. Books are still being written about how to reconcile the two Wallaces. The author G.K. Chesterton, on Wallace's 81st birthday in 1904, proclaimed him one of the most interesting men of the 19th century because, quote, he was both the founder of a revolution, scientific materialist evolution, and a counter-revolution, spiritualist theistic evolution. Chesterton chose as the other most interesting person of the 19th century the poet Walt Whitman, who also had no problem living with contradictions. In his poem, Song of Myself, Whitman admitted, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." Wallace could apply himself brilliantly to see how far scientific method would take him, and it enabled him to unravel puzzles and mysteries that had baffled naturalists for centuries. When Darwin was puzzled about insect mimicry or peacock's tails, he appealed to Wallace, who usually came up with a new angle. "You are the right man to appeal to in a difficulty," Darwin told him. So the question remains, how did a man of such brilliance allow himself to be so completely fooled by tricksters, by con men, by scam artists? And I think I have a clue about the answer. The first part of it is Wallace's extreme honesty and transparency. He thought that they were honest. He was incapable of looking someone in the eye and lying to them. It was not difficult for some of these medium characters to do exactly that. They would look you in the eye and they would lie. That was something that was beyond Wallace's comprehension. Naive and trusting, he refused to think the worst of people who spoke like earnest seekers after truth. Wallace was a keen observer, Huxley noted. He could sit in the jungle and observe and record everything that was going on. He trusted his senses and his reason because there was nothing there to deliberately trick him. There was no misdirection, the greatest tool of the magician, the illusionist, the con man, the swindler, to purposely swerve your attention from what you're observing and distract it to something else.
That was a basic principle of tricksters that Wallace never figured on when he was dealing with so-called mediums and psychics. The most profound reason that Wallace was so easily taken in by spiritualistic impostors, of course, was that he held a sincere, deep-seated belief in the world of spirit. He had concluded that Earth is a place where human souls are schooled, improved, and perfected for their next higher life. If mediums or channelers are occasionally caught in trickery and fraud, he argued, that does not disprove the reality of spirit. Similarly, the existence of some counterfeit money only shows that plenty of real money must exist somewhere.
As old age approached for Wallace, he still could not find a way of making money. Teaching jobs were few and far between, and he ended up grading examination papers for students in science classes. A very laborious way for a man of his age and accomplishments to make a living. And Darwin thought it was a shame and decided to apply for a government pension for Wallace for his lifelong service to natural history. So Darwin went around to scientific friends, putting names on a petition. A note came to him from his friend, the great botanist Joseph Hooker of Kew Gardens, who said, "Charles, I can hardly see how I can apply to one's friends in government for a pension for Wallace, where he has been a public and leading spiritualist." Darwin wrote to Huxley, What should I say to that? Huxley replied, "Just tell him that Wallace's beliefs about an afterlife are his own personal business, and besides, they are no worse than the superstitions of the majority of the country." So Darwin wrote that back to Hooker, and Wallace did get his pension, but he still didn't get any statues. He was not buried in Westminster Abbey, although he got a little plaque near Darwin's tomb there. But he wanted to be buried out in the countryside in Dorset in a grave in a little rural cemetery without any fuss. But it had a most peculiar gravestone on it. It was a huge log of petrified wood jutting straight up into the air. Whose idea that was is not known, but you can draw your own conclusions. It's still there after 100 years, Wallace's only monument in stone. But Wallace finally did get his statue. During the Wallace Centenary celebration at the London Natural History Museum, exactly 100 years after Wallace's death at the age of 93, the great naturalist filmmaker Sir David Attenborough unveils a new and wonderful statue. Rather than adopting a heroic pose, sculptor Anthony Smith chose to depict him as a working field biologist and collector in the Malaysian rainforest, intent on netting the long-sought golden bird-wing butterfly. That huge, rare butterfly gave him such a thrill when he caught it that he nearly fainted from excitement. In addition, a long-neglected oil portrait of Wallace was hung near Darwin's statue on the staircase in the main hall, facing the entrance to the museum. Looking back to 1882, we see the way it looked when Darwin's 2-ton marble statue was placed there to replace that of Richard Owen, the museum's founder. Darwin ruled that staircase for many years, with some absences and returns, and now he is back. And Wallace is also back. And here we see Wallace scholars, assorted dignitaries, and affiliated intelligentsia ascend the staircase to unveil the portrait of Wallace soon after the statue was unveiled. At the same time, his memory was being celebrated in New York, Singapore, and Wales, and thousands of his letters and writings were being preserved and placed online to make his life and thought accessible to future generations.
Darwin became melancholy in his last days, although he never regretted having devoted his life to science and accepting the finality of death. Wallace, on the other hand, was cheerful and optimistic to the last, and looked forward to new vistas of adventure and discovery in the spirit world. Both of them have helped us on the path to discovering who we are. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to the John Templeton Foundation. And good night, Alfred Russel Wallace, wherever you are.